Historical context of Christianization. Early Europe. During the Christianization of Europe, 5th to 12th centuries, the Catholic Church and Christian monarchs worked together to convert pagan societies. This often involved a combination of missionary work, forced conversions, and the destruction of pagan religious sites. Colonial expansion. In the Americas, Africa, and Australia, the Church played a key role in the colonization process, using missionary efforts to convert indigenous peoples and justify European domination. Role of Catholic schools in indoctrination. Monastic and cathedral schools were established to educate the children of pagan or recently converted families, particularly the children of elites. While not all of these children were forcibly removed, many were sent to these schools as part of broader efforts to Christianize their communities. The goal was to erase pagan cultural identities and replace them with Christian norms, including the suppression of native languages, traditions, and practices. In North America, Australia, and other colonized regions, the Church operated residential or boarding schools that forcibly removed indigenous children from their families. These schools aimed to eradicate indigenous cultures and assimilate children into Euro-Christian society. Over 150,000 indigenous children in Canada, 100,000 Native American children in the United States, and tens of thousands of Aboriginal children in Australia were affected by these systems. Conditions in these schools were often horrific, with widespread reports of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, as well as neglect and malnutrition. Many children died, and those who survived were left with lasting trauma. Methods of indoctrination. Cultural erasure. Indigenous and pagan children were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their traditions, or maintain their cultural identities. This amounted to cultural genocide. Pagan festivals, rituals, and symbols were systematically replaced or banned, and indigenous spiritual practices were suppressed. Religious instruction. Children were taught Christian doctrine, often through coercive methods, and were punished for practicing their native religions or speaking their native languages. The goal was to create a new generation of devout Christians who would reject their ancestral cultures and identities. Forced assimilation. The use of education as a tool for cultural assimilation is a common thread between the Christianization of Europe and the residential school systems in colonized regions. In both cases, the goal was to erase indigenous cultures and replace them with Christian norms. Monarchs and the Church worked together to enforce these policies, with monarchs providing political and military support and the Church providing ideological justification. Systemic abuse. The Church's involvement in these systems has been marked by systemic abuse, including the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse of children. The Church's handling of these abuses, including its efforts to cover up crimes and protect perpetrators, has further undermined its moral authority. Legacy and impact. Intergenerational trauma. The forced removal of children from their families and communities has had profound and lasting effects, including the loss of language, culture, and identity. The trauma experienced by survivors has been passed down through generations, affecting indigenous and pagan-descended communities to this day. Cultural genocide. The suppression of indigenous and pagan cultures has had a devastating impact on the affected communities, many of which are still working to reclaim their heritage. Calls for justice and reconciliation. In recent years, there have been efforts to address the legacy of these systems, including official apologies, reparations, and the establishment of truth and reconciliation commissions. However, much work remains to be done to achieve justice and healing for the affected communities. Moral responsibility. The Church's involvement in these systems raises profound ethical questions about its moral responsibility for the harm caused. While the Church has taken some steps to address its historical wrongs, many critics argue that these efforts have been insufficient. Charity versus harm. The Church's charitable works, while commendable, cannot erase the harm caused by its involvement in events like the residential school systems or the Inquisitions. The scale of harm, millions of lives lost, cultures destroyed, and communities traumatized, is so vast that it cannot be easily offset by positive contributions. The role of Catholic schools in the indoctrination of pagan and indigenous children is a dark chapter in the history of the Catholic Church. These systems were part of broader efforts to eradicate non-Christian cultures and impose Christianity, leaving a legacy of trauma and cultural loss that continues to affect communities today.